I'm Amanda Koth, and I'd like to share with you some of my findings from my action research. I've been teaching online since the pandemic struck, but at the end of that pandemic-initiated online teaching, I chose to continue online. And I have been teaching upper elementary in a fully online setting for the 2020 to 21 and 21 to 22 school years. Because of a more manageable class size in the second year that I was teaching fully online, I was able to implement weekly one-on-one conferences with all of my students. And it was in this context that I chose my action research topics. I conducted my action research, intervention, and data collection for 9 weeks in March through May. Using a framework for self-advocacy from a Test et al. Article and study, my goal was to teach and to measure the 4 self-advocacy traits that they outline. My data analysis consisted of listening to more than 20 recorded lessons, whole class Zoom lessons, and more than 20 recorded one-on-one conferences. I also used qualitative coding to identify themes across the lessons, across one-on-ones, across other forms of student response, and notes that I took during all one-on-ones, even those I didn't record. The most important resource to support self-advocacy in students in 4th through 6th grade is a teacher who consistently connects with their students. In my data analysis, I kept track of the resources that I used. And what I found was 75% of the time, it was connected with some kind of teacher engagement. Either I was guiding them or I was giving them directions and they were completing it, and then they would come back and I would give some more feedback. So only about 25% of the time was it truly independent. So this led me to look at some order patterns in my lessons, because at this point I had been teaching online already for a year and a half. And so a lot of the choices I was making came from experience, even if I wasn't laying out my reasoning ahead of time. And what I found was that there is a certain pattern. Whatever the lesson, there's a certain format that I used that allowed me to always be building relationships, to always be infusing SEL. And I think of it like a ping pong match. In most of my lessons, I begin with some kind of first work or introduction. I prompt students to reflect. I connect some kind of review from a previous lesson, or in some cases, I just ask students to answer a question that is really in no way related to content or a lesson. I would often tell my students, okay, we're going to get our brain juices flowing. When I was in college, I learned this as activating prior knowledge, or the lesson hook. So if I can give them something to get them thinking early on and start to extend their thinking into a personal connection, it'll prepare them for what's to come. This is also because I realize that there are some students who, like me, might have the best of intentions of getting up and eating breakfast before class, but when reality hits, they get there at the last minute and they're not quite ready yet. And so just understanding that giving my students a couple minutes at the start of class is going to allow some of them in particular that time that they need to feel settled and to feel comfortable if they want to turn on their camera for the lesson. Usually shortly after this introduction, I play a video. The video is connected to the lesson objective for the day. Students enjoy the video. I may have given them a little bit of guidance, something to make connections with, but this first video, I'm not asking for a ton of student participation during the video. This allows me as a teacher to introduce vocabulary and content early on in the lesson. It grabs their attention, it's a video, it's fun, and this gives me time to follow up with any students who were not engaging in that first work. After the video, it is time to present the big idea or the objective for the lesson. Now, I might get a little bit of a response from students on how they felt about that video, depending on what it was. But I give my students a focus or a question. And then I play the video again. So they've already watched it once, and they hopefully have the big picture of whatever that video was about, or a song if it was a learning song. And now they're listening, they're watching again with the intention of noticing something. This is also a time students are going to maybe be taking some notes. Before I play the video again, this is one place that I infuse a personal connection. This is something I noticed in my data analysis that I didn't realize was I very often use myself as an example. I make a personal connection, and then I would model, well, so when I watch this video now, if I were you, I would really be listening for blank, blank, blank. When this video ends, I usually allow some time for students to answer some questions, to continue taking notes, to make sure that they're really grabbing onto what it was from that video. Remember, in the classroom, you're walking around. Online, how do I make sure my students are engaged? And so I noticed that throughout the lessons that I listened to was that quite often I would have this ping pong effects where I do something, I'm expecting students to do something. I do something, I want students to do something. But in that, I would give myself this time that I could use to reach out to students and to their guardians. So they come back, and it's time for what I called a Miss Koth dialogue in my data analysis. There is a time in most of my lessons where I talked, and it was my direct instruction, some kind of a dialogue. Sometimes I would be teaching something through a story, and sometimes I would be teaching something in a more engaging manner. But during this direct instruction, constantly asking for student feedback. All right, if you're still with me, unmute yourself and say, I'm still with you, Miss Koth. If I haven't lost you yet, I want you to type beluga in the chat. All right, I need everyone to unmute yourself and count to 3. Or I might just be asking for feedback on the topics. So everybody in the chat, tell me one thing that you really want to learn next time about places on the map. This is also a time that, depending on the resource I was using for the lesson, students might be engaging, for example, in a collaborative discussion, or it could be an individual activity that they're doing on a Google Doc, but that they've shared with me so that I can be seeing it and giving them feedback. They might be taking notes and then holding that up to the camera, and I can see the notes that they're taking. So what I found was that there are a ton of different resources, a ton of different tools that I used and that students used. And there wasn't necessarily a particular aspect of the tools that was the strength, but it was more the method that I used to engage students with those tools. So usually towards the end, I would present kind of a final resource or a question or an activity that would allow students to practice the skills and demonstrate their understanding of our big idea or our objective for that day. As we finish the lesson together, because of the way my lessons kind of went back and forth, I found in a lot of cases as I wrapped the lesson up, it was in a lot of ways like I was right there with my students, kind of enjoying that feeling of like, whew, we worked really hard during this lesson. What did we like? What did we learn? What was good? What are we going to take moving forward? When I analyzed the data source of my lesson recordings and the resources that I used to teach self-advocacy. The main purpose of that analysis was in response to my research question of what do self-advocacy resources look like for students in 4th through 6th grade in an online setting. What I ended up learning from that analysis goes so much further than that, because I was able to look at myself and my own teaching style in a different way. And I wasn't setting out to do that. So I analyzed about 20 different lessons, and I really didn't expect to so quickly find an order pattern, because I know how different every lesson is. So when I did start to notice the way I would engage my students, the way I would include videos at different times and replay videos, it allowed me to think about my reasoning behind it. Some of the things that you can't see in a recording are the messages that the teacher is sending to a parent, or the messages the teacher is sending in the chat privately to a student. There are sometimes whole conversations that are happening because maybe there's trauma going on in a certain student's life in their home. And as a teacher, I'm having to simultaneously support all of my students, but also determine whether or not my student should even be in Zoom, or do I need to tell my student, you know what, I'll get you caught up later. Those are the things that I realize the format of my lesson in an online context allows me to do the same things that I would want to do in the classroom, where I could walk around and check in with individual students. Now that I am more aware of that, I think it will actually help me in my lesson planning, not only deciding on the objective, the standards, and the content, but choosing multimedia components that will engage students, but that will also give me as a teacher time to do those check-ins with students behind the scenes. When I analyzed my one-on-one lessons, not only did I watch and listen back to the 20 plus recorded sessions that I had, but I also had notes and attendance data from 100 other individual conferences in the March through May timeframe. Using the same methods that I used when analyzing my whole class recordings, I was able to recognize similar patterns and pull out themes that were unique to the one-on-ones. One resource that I used very intentionally were individual Google Slides that began with a template, and in my first one-on-one meetings with each student, I would allow them to choose the theme, and then we would use the different slides to guide some of our conversation. Initially, my thought with this was that it would be a great way of setting goals and tracking goals. I also used it for students before we set any goals, for them to reflect on their strengths and their interests. Some students had great success with these goal slides. They loved them. They would go on their own. I had a few students who, when I look at the history in the Google Slides document, I could see times that they opened it themselves. They added something, even if it was a comment. One student added about, "This week I learned that I like having short hair," because she had just gotten her hair cut. Other students, we didn't use their Google Slides at all, or we used it once or twice in the semester, and the rest of the time they were just so involved in having conversation or getting help with something that the Google Slides weren't as much of a priority. What I found in looking at all of their Google Slides and looking at the data that I collected from the one-on-one conferences was that the Google Slides themselves were not a good tool or a bad tool. They were allowing for the diverse needs of students because some students responded very well to them. But what made those Google Slides actually a really excellent tool in my practice was the way that they helped me. So they were not something super fancy, and there was not huge data to say, wow, using these Google Slides during one-on-ones really helped students. None of the students mentioned them in their reflections about their growth. A lot of the students used them and were able to use them to talk about their growth, but they didn't specifically mention it. So, is it a tool I will use in the future? Yes. And the reason is that it helped me stay organized. Some tools themselves, like these Google Slides, might not be flashy, research-proven, high-quality digital tools, and that's okay. Because it's much less about the tools that you choose, but rather how those tools support your ability to connect with your students and their ability to connect with the content with you. So even if it's not directly tied to a specific student outcome, it supports me so that I could keep track. Have I talked with the student about knowing themselves? Have I talked with them about their dreams and ambitions? Did we talk about what it means to know your rights? Looking at the resources in my whole class lessons, looking at the resources I use in my Google Slides, and then also looking at the data that I had based on how many conferences my students participated in, the number of times certain resources or technology tools were used in a lesson with the teacher or were used in a lesson with only the student completing it independently. What I found, what the data showed me, was that there was not a particular tool that I used this year that was more effective than the others. One piece of data I included in my background information on my students was the number of active guardians in the home. Another piece of information I included was how long students had been doing online education, and another was how long they had been my students. Some had been with me for 2 years and some had only been with me for 2 months. The most noticeable impact was the length of time that they had been my students. Seeing that in the data provides a quantifiable foundation for what we as teachers work so hard to do, which is build authentic relationships with our students. The student survey, the perception surveys, and when I had conversations with students in one-on-ones in my recordings that I analyzed, the students felt that the greatest benefit was being able to talk with their teacher or have conversations with their teacher. So 40% of students chose that they're able to communicate better with teachers online than in person. 33% of students agreed that they're able to communicate better with teachers in person, or that they would prefer to communicate with teachers in person than online. And almost 30% said that they're able to communicate with teachers the same if they were online or in person. What does all of this reveal about technology tools and elementary student success in virtual settings? I think it reveals that the teacher's ability to build authentic relationships, facilitate participation, and scaffold interactions using digital tools is what leads to self-advocacy traits in elementary online students. What have you found helpful about the one-on-one conferences that we've done this year?
I definitely open up more easily.
Open up more easily?
Yeah.
Just being like one-on-one instead of in a group?
Yeah.
Yeah. What have you thought about our one-on-one conferences? And you can be honest too if there's stuff you didn't like, you know? I mean, Merrick gave me some really helpful feedback on, you know, something that he didn't particularly like. I was like, oh yeah, that's good. I didn't think about that.
I don't like talking about homework.
You don't like talking about homework. What else? Good or bad?
It's definitely been better since we've been doing the one-on-ones.
Like, what have you noticed has been better?
My mood has changed a lot more.
Like all the time or just in school?
All the time.
All the time.
Thank you, Mom. To my dear friends and teachers, I just want to say thank you for being in my life. Without you guys, I don't know what my life would be like. I'm so happy and lucky to have you guys. I'll remember you forever in my life. Love you. From Jacqueline, Garcia to teachers and friends.
Oh, that's what I learned throughout my action research about the resources and the tools that were a part of this process is that the key to an effective tool or resource is a connected teacher.
I like that I am able to talk to you without anybody interrupting or anybody else talking, where I can just talk and you can talk to me. It's just a one-on-one conversation.
I'm gonna miss you.
I'm gonna miss you too.